Hello, my name is Daryl Copeland. On behalf of the Group of Seven, which I chair, I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar on the future of Canadian foreign policy. Is it time for a reset? I'd like to say this topic resonates deeply with the origins of the G78. Almost 40 years ago, a statement was issued by 78 prominent Canadians urging the government of Pierre Elliott Trudeau to embrace an ambitious foreign policy aimed at peace, disarmament, global economic justice, and strengthened multilateral cooperation towards these ends. That statement, which led to the founding of the Group of 78, seems more relevant than ever in today's world, with increasing tensions among nuclear-armed states, widening economic inequalities, and multilateral organizations that are incredibly stretched by the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis. And those aims continue to inform the G78's programming. In that regard, I'd like to mention our upcoming annual policy conference on the future of peacekeeping in the transition to a more peaceful world, why UN peace operations are critical and need to be expanded. As with all of our events, the pandemic has necessitated adopting a virtual format this year. So instead of a 2-day in-person event, we are planning a series of 6 webinars spaced over 2 weeks from the last week of September to the first week in October. Please check our website for details and mark your calendar. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our distinguished moderator for this panel, Margaret Huber. Margaret is a former diplomat who has been ambassador to a number of countries in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. She is very familiar with the international organizations, including the UN, the Asian Development Bank, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Today, among other things, she is a director and past president of the Canadian International Council, which, like the G78, fosters dialogue and debate on foreign policy. Margaret, thank you so much for moderating our panel today.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you, Roy, at the kind invitation of the G78, with 2 such distinguished speakers and longtime friends, dare I say. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion. A lot of people are tuning in today, and I know that many more will also be calling up the recorded video afterwards on YouTube. So bravo to a group of 78. Canadians are worried about the global pandemic, about economic recovery, even if they have a job, about what may happen with the November 3 US election, and again, pending vaccines for the pandemic, about an effective response at every level of government. And then there's foreign policy. Canadians do seem to be united on one thing, and most of them are keen on keeping our border with the US closed to the end of the year, or as long as it takes. June 17, when Canada lost its latest bid for a seat on the UN Security Council, seems like so long ago. We are, however, left with questions about our role in the UN and other organizations, about Canada's foreign policy, whether this is the time for a reset, and if so, how do we go about it? We're very fortunate to have with us today Peggy Mason and Daryl Copeland to address these questions. Peggy Mason, since 2014, has been CEO of the Rideau Institute, an independent, nonprofit think tank focused on policy research and advocacy in foreign defense and national security policy. Former Canadian ambassador for disarmament to the UN, 1989 to 95, she is an expert in the political diplomatic aspects of UN peace operations training, and she has also chaired the Canadian Centre for Treaty Compliance's Advisory Board from 2005 to 2013. She completed her studies at the University of Ottawa, one of my alma mater, I'm proud to say, University of Toronto, and Laval. Daryl Copeland, Canadian diplomatic and security expert, has served in Thailand. He also was elected a record 5 times on the executive board of the Professional Association of Foreign Service Officers, an organization which I also had the honor of serving as chief negotiator, although sadly not at the same time as Daryl. Daryl undertook a 3-year tour with the Canadian Institute of International Affairs, the precursor of the Canadian International Council, which I still serve. He was long recognized by his peers as a thinker of innovation, for example, in science diplomacy. He has received the Canadian Foreign Service Officer Award. He's the author of a provocative and well worth reading book. In 2009, he published Guerrilla Diplomacy, Rethinking International Relations. A graduate of Western, of Carleton's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, where I believe, Roy, you're still teaching. He is now serving on policy boards, teaching at workshops and conferences, at foreign policy institutes, and at universities such as the Université de Montréal's Center for International Studies and Research. I'd now like to invite our 2 distinguished speakers to make opening remarks outlining their vision of a reset, taking stock of emerging national and global realities, along with Canada's international aspirations and capabilities. Then, after 5 minutes each, there'll be a speaker's dialogue, followed by, and I know you're waiting for this, questions and answers from the audience. I know that that will be very lively indeed. So, starting off with you, Peggy.
Much, and it's a great pleasure to be on this panel today. You'll forgive me with this one point I'll make. When Margaret described the Rideau Institute, she described it as an independent think tank. Well, independent means that we take no money from government or industry. And that means that we get all our money from donations from ordinary Canadians. And so, hence, if you're interested in supporting good, progressive foreign policy, go to the Rideau Institute website and see how you can help us out. With that, I will turn. Now, in 5 minutes, of course, we can't do all of the things that Margaret asked us to do, but we've got the dialogue to do that in as well. So I'm going to start by trying to just highlight, because each one of these is a massive thing, I'm going to try and highlight some of, mainly the global, but at least one national reality that Canada has to face if it is going to do a foreign policy reset. And of course, in terms of those emerging global realities, the very first one is the US desire to create, in essence, 2 completing blocks. Cold War 2.0 in a quite different world. As a declining power, with a massive military industrial complex. The US outspends the next 7 countries combined, exacerbating its need for enemies. It is seeking to shore up its position. It's declining relative to, to emerging powers, not least China. And to shore up its position, it's clearly trying to create 2 blocks. And it, of course, would lead one of those blocks against China as the leader of the other bloc, and Western countries are expected to fall into line or else. This is taking place against a backdrop of a failing neoliberal economic model. And that term failing was applied by none other than Financial Times columnist, economist Martin Wolf. That is a model that's delivering ever more inequality within and between nations and creating a class of super rich who, in my view, whose wealth is a clear and present danger, to use Cold War language, to democracy. And this is also, this desire of the US to create 2 completing blocks, the potency of that US effort is in no small measure because of the weaponization of the American dollar. Because of the preeminent role of the US dollar as the reserve currency, because of the dependence of virtually any company, except very small local companies in a global economy, on the banking system, and therefore the long tentacles of the American banking system, that means that the threat of US sanctions for not falling into line is very grave indeed. And of course, the big example there is the Iran nuclear deal, a deal enshrined in a UN Security Council resolution. But when the US chose to walk away from that deal and reimpose illegal sanctions on the United States, even the European Union, which did its best to shield its companies from the secondary US sanctions, could not. And virtually no company is doing business with Iran, except, of course, that's the charge against Huawei. The charge against Huawei and the CEO Meng is that they were engaging in a trade with China, with Iran. So the weaponization of the American dollar is a huge problem to contend with, because it essentially forces countries to comply with policies they might not otherwise like. And then, just to round off in the 5 minutes, we have, of course, the ongoing effects of the global war on terror. We don't use that term. Some people call them forever wars, but the militarization of virtually everything. Rather than the UN Charter vision of the peaceful resolution of disputes, we've seen the militarization of fundamentally political disputes. We've also seen a massive national investment, including in Canada, in national security infrastructure. And the clear example of that would be a $1 billion CSIS, Canadian Security Intelligence Service headquarters, a palace it's been called, versus a global health network, intelligence network, global public health intelligence network run out of Public Health Canada, which was allowed to atrophy. So in the very end, we're left with our 3 existential threats. First, of course, climate catastrophe. Second, and this is not paid attention to enough, and that is the destruction of nature. And then the third one, the Cold War has not left us, and that is the growing danger of a nuclear confrontation, a nuclear war. And so that's the backdrop. That's a pretty big list of problems, and Daryl will fill us in on, more dimensions that I haven't touched on. Thank you. Oh, we can't. Microphones.
Peggy, you're always a hard act to follow.
Thank you so much. We'll now turn to Daryl before we have the dialogue between our 2 speakers when they can engage with each other on these important issues.
Thank you, Margaret. And it's great to be among old friends and colleagues, and I'm grateful to the G78 for having included me, and I'm particularly looking forward to hearing from participants out in Cyberland. I'd like to comment on the transformed international operating environment in which Canadian foreign policy is finding itself and having to attempt to navigate, and then look at some key questions that I think should be front and center for those who are concerned with Canada's place in the world and in particular how to restore it. And I would do this under the rubric of something like bringing Canada back, faint hope or mission impossible. So by way of setting the scene, I think that there's, in the early 21st century, three remarkable developments which were not with us in the 20th. And it's not that territorial disputes and trade negotiations and international legal negotiations and conflict resolution aren't still with us. It's just that we have the emergence of what I would describe as a new threat set. And these are wicked transnational, mainly S&T driven issues. And this is climate, environmental collapse, pandemic, disease. I could go on and on. I've got a list, I think, of about 25 of them that I use in my S&T course. But what they all have in common, besides the fact that they're rooted in science and driven by technology, is that there are no military solutions. Because you can't call in an airstrike on a warming climate. You can't garrison against pandemic disease. And you can't send out an expeditionary force to occupy the alternatives to a carbon economy. So this raises a really fundamental but never addressed policy question. Why do almost all governments in the world continue to put the majority of their international policy resources into defense rather than diplomacy and development? So that's point one. Point two is that power is restless. It never stays in any one place for long. Look at the history of imperialism in the world. So power is shifting, and there's been quite a bit of focus on the retreat of the US from international leadership and the related transfer of power and influence from the North Atlantic to the Asia Pacific. I think that that's clear. I think it's demonstrable. Less attention has been given to another type of power shift, and it's related to the end of state centricity in international relations. And this involves power shifting upwards to supranational institutions, outwards mainly to multinational corporations, and in some cases, NGOs, think tanks, the Gates Foundation, Mr. Soros, Mr. Buffett, etc., and downwards to other levels of government. So states, provinces, municipalities, the most underrepresented institutions in international relations, and even individuals. Think of Bono. I think he's probably got more influence than the presidents of many small countries. So power shifting North America to Asia Pacific, but also up, out, and down, all creating great problems for people that are working for states. And finally, the widening global governance gap, the disconnect between the challenges that we're facing, and I've outlined a few of them, and our collective capacity to respond. So to summarize about this transformed international operating environment, I'll just say that this is not the world that those who framed the Atlantic Charter ever would have imagined would have emerged a little over half a century after they wrote that document. So for our audience, and apropos of our consideration of the reframing or resetting of Canadian foreign policy, I guess the first question is Canada back? Is there a record of underperformance in terms of diplomatic initiative, global leadership, and the achievement of demonstrable results under the Trudeau government since 2015? Secondly, What are the implications of our second failure to win an elected seat in the UN Security Council? It seems to me that we've gone from a shoo-in to an also-ran. And I think that this is a question that's worthy of sustained reflection. Thirdly, there's a lot of talk in government paper about us having a feminist foreign policy. Well, besides the question of what is that, I think it's really important to consider whether it's possible to square that assertion against the decision to proceed with the sale of the light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most misogynist countries in the world by anybody's measure. Fourthly, what about the serial failure to address global affairs' myriad and long-standing capacity, performance, structural, leadership, and bureaucratic cultural problems? And is it fit for purpose? And I would say absolutely not. And finally, I would ask our audience to think about the preconditions for an international policy renaissance in an increasingly what I would call heteropolar world, which is to say the various competing poles are defined by difference rather than similarity. What might the preconditions be for an international policy renaissance on the part of Canada? Is it possible? Is it a faint hope, or is it mission impossible? And I'll stop there for now.
I'd like to now throw onto the table for the speakers' dialogue a question: why should Canadians care, particularly youth? And perhaps you could both engage on that question.
Well, I guess in a nutshell, and of course, in terms of youth, presumably they need a planet for a longer period of time than I do. And if we don't get a handle on both climate change and the destruction of nature and averting a nuclear war, which would destroy the planet, then we need international cooperation. And we're seeing the opposite of that right now. I mean, diplomacy is absolutely fundamental. International cooperation, countries working together to solve, I mean, all of the problems we've been discussing here to this point, Daryl and I, are global problems. They require global solutions. And that means that international policy is not something far away for every Canadian. It's something that if we don't get right is going to have a terrible impact on each and every Canadian. And of course, COVID is showing us this every day. If the world doesn't conquer COVID, then no individual country will have conquered COVID.
Daryl, you're working a lot with youth in universities, in workshops, in courses. What do you think, and what are you hearing from them?
Yeah, plus in my years as director of the Canadian Institute of International Affairs, I spent an awful lot of time trying to engineer higher levels of youth engagement. My sense is that in years gone by, and I'm thinking of the 60s and 70s when we had increases in individual incomes, and there was a degree of foreign policy consensus around Canada as an honest broker and a helpful fixer and a peacekeeper and so on, all the things that we aren't now. It was rather easier to bring youth along. The world of the 21st century is so much more complex and the challenges so much more difficult. I think that Canadian youth has redrawn the borders of their personal engagement a lot closer to the front door. There's concerns about will they have a job. There's concerns about will they be able to have a home. There's concerns about will they be able to afford a family. So international policy, I think, seems to them something rather abstract and ethereal. And I do my best to bring home to them that we're, as Peggy suggested, we're talking about their future. But I'll tell you, and I spend a lot of my time trying to do this, it's an extremely hard sell.
Other aspects of the resetting, Peggy, Daryl, that you want to touch on?
Yes, there's lots to say on the reset, and I guess from my perspective, the first thing that has to be addressed in terms of a foreign policy reset is the terrible loss of capacity at Global Affairs Canada. That, you know, there had not been sufficient investment prior to the Harper era. But during the Harper era, I mean, there was no policy role. 10 years where there was no policy role for the department. Senior people leaving early, no mentoring, therefore, of or a loss in mentoring of younger diplomats, and a real loss of capacity, to the point that today, over half of the people at Global Affairs have never served abroad. The senior leadership, the most senior leadership, are not diplomats, are not professional diplomats. And while, of course, I would agree that there are new skills, and Daryl can speak to those in science and technology that diplomats have to have, first and foremost, the world of international diplomacy has become more challenging and more complex, and we need professional foreign service officers who see this as a career, not as a 4-year stepping stone to some other department. If Canada is going to be serious about its international policy, it's got to be serious about equipping our foreign affairs with the tools to do the job. And that means much more. That means more funding, but it also means a dedicated plan to rebuild diplomatic capacity. And I would say that is a very urgent priority. I think things are so bad at this point that while I'm completely in favor of a foreign policy review, we haven't had one for 15 years, and I would want to get we're going to work to try and get every party committed in the next election to there being one, because I don't think there will be one while there's a minority government. But that foreign policy review, I don't think can be carried out by Global Affairs. So my suggestion, and I'm really borrowing an idea of U of O Professor Roland Paris, it should be an outside committee that has both inside government foreign policy expertise, but also expertise from academia and the NGOs, and at least one international participant that has the authority to commission studies and that can really look hard at how Canada, what makes sense for Canada going forward, and what are the tools that we need to do that. So my message, my first message is very much that it is an urgent and pressing need to develop and implement a plan for rebuilding diplomatic capacity for Canada.
Before I ask Daryl to comment on that, can I just selfishly point out that the CIC is very much touting the advantages of citizen engagement in a multicultural society like ours, tapping many groups, but also individuals, particularly those who normally don't get engaged in foreign policy. What are your thoughts on that, Daryl, and also on what Peggy has been saying?
Yeah, happy to share my thoughts on that or anything else with you, Margaret. But I was working in the department during the decade of darkness under Harper, when we had a revolving door foreign ministry with 7 foreign ministers, including Maxime Bernier, in 8 years. when diplomats were muzzled, when ambassadors were disempowered, when communications were centralized in the Privy Council office, and when there was active de-resourcing of the department. And it was an awful period. Jump from there to the tumultuous welcome that was given to Justin Trudeau on his first visit to the Pearson building. I personally was very uncomfortable with that because it didn't strike me as nonpartisan and impartial, which is the way that public servants should be. But it was certainly understandable. And in that regard, I think that there was a tremendous opening created in 2015 with the Trudeau government's election. And I think that they've squandered it. I think that the challenge will be to restore Canada's reputation and influence, not through rhetoric, but through effective action. And that's going to take capacity, resources, and political will. But, you know, not only have we not seen the reinvestment, but we've seen some very serious foreign policy errors, gaps, and missteps. And it just seems so far away from the sunny ways and the heady days of Trudeau's star power, near universal media adulation, cover of the Rolling Stone, lead editorials in the New York Times. There was an opening there, and we didn't go through it. And then there was the vacationing with the Aga Khan, playing Mr. Dress-Up in India, inviting felons to cocktail parties, the self-inflicted cratering of Canada's bilateral relationship with China, and a host of other foreign policy missteps and lost opportunities. Now, they've done a good job, or as good as you can, I think, in managing our relationship with the USA. Under very trying circumstances. They've negotiated a couple of trade agreements, the new NAFTA, free trade with Europe. They accepted 50,000, 60,000 Syrian refugees. They convened the Lima Group on Venezuela. They've highlighted the problems associated with microplastics. But you know what? Compared to Canada's role in organizing the Rio Conference on Environment and Development, on ending apartheid in Southern Africa, in organizing a couple of North-South summits, and in bringing forth Minister Axworthy's human security agenda, this stuff just pales in comparison. And so I think on balance, the government's record of foreign policy achievement really reflects significant underperformance. I think they over-advertised and under-delivered. And not only that, there's been a lot of hypocrisy and contradiction. I mean, from Saudi arms sales and the pipeline and fossil fuel advocacy while trying to be a champion of climate change, to the very unfinished business related to the treatment of Afghan refugees, to the mismanagement of the absolutely critical relationship that Canada should be developing with the countries of the Asia Pacific. I think the past 5.5 years have demonstrated not only little learning and lost opportunities, but they've just produced almost nothing to boast about.
Daryl, I think there would be many who would not disagree with you, but let's look to the future and turn to a very pertinent question from General Jim Cox about what you've just been describing, and that is, where are our statesmen with big thoughts about a more mature Canada who can focus on these major issues that you both have described? Thoughts, either Peggy, Daryl?
Well, I'm going to jump in because this is billed as a dialogue, so I'm going to respond. I have to respond to a couple of things that Daryl has said, and then come back to the question about vision. My short answer on the vision goes back to my discussion of lack of capacity. It's very, very hard to have a vision, to create a vision. I mean, I'm essentially describing that we don't have the capacity at the moment internally to develop that vision, which is why I think it's so important to start the reset process with an independent committee, and that would then go into Parliament. I mean, it would then go through all the inside processes, but it would start, the jolt would come initially from the outside. But I want to come to a couple of other things, because I think they're important points. Daryl said way back, and then referenced that Canada went from a shoe-in for the UN Security Council win, to losing. In fact, that's not true. We weren't a shoe-in. We decided to run in 2016 against two of the most popular countries at the United Nations, Ireland and Norway, who had been running since 2005 and 2007, respectively. That was the most rookie of rookie mistakes. And so, did Global Affairs tell the PCO that, just how risky this was? Doesn't matter how popular he is in the front page of the New York Times and Harper's and everywhere else. As the people casting those votes, they have been paying attention to Ireland and Norway's campaigns, as I said, since 2005 and 2009. So I think the original decision to run, of course the government wants to start off, but there should have been pushback saying, look, just hold off a little bit, just hold off a couple of years here. And then the other thing I have to comment on is that, there's only probably one area Daryl and I disagree on, and that's on the Lima Group. I think, a group that was standing up criticizing Venezuela's human rights record when it contained a number of countries with worse human rights records, bearing in mind that Venezuela is a direct competitor of Canada in the dirty oil business. And under Harper, that's why he clearly lined up with the American government with the imposition of sanctions. And the worst thing about the Lima Group was its original statement didn't even rule out the use of force. That's got to be about as far from Canada and the peaceful resolution of disputes and our internationalist tradition as you could ever get. And it was only after the EU contact group made a very clear statement that the use of force must be ruled out that the Lima Group reluctantly, went along with that statement. So I do not see the Lima Group as a shining example. I see it as a very reprehensible example of something started under Harper that unfortunately the Liberal government did not change. And of course it's hard. I recognize that. There were a number of positions, of policies, not least with respect to Iran and the closing of the embassy that the Harper government took, that are very, very difficult to undo. But when you've got a strong mandate, and in the first part of that mandate, that's when you do it. But unfortunately, at that time, we didn't have a full-time foreign minister. We had Chrystia Freeland, who was really a Canada-US trade minister, who, in her spare time would focus on her pet peeves like Ukraine and Russia. And so we did not have a full-time foreign minister who would really look hard at how to get out from under some of the most damaging of the Harper policies. And of course, the sale of armored vehicles, biggest misnomer in the world, light armored vehicles. They're heavily armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia is probably the worst example of a Harper policy that this government did not manage to get out from with under.
As we continue on our Q&A, and by the way, I do believe the G78 will be, when they record this session, have a provision for questions that are raised but don't have time for today. So folks, if you have questions that aren't raised today, they will be addressed and we'll get back to you. There are two questions that have arisen that I'd like to meld kind of into one. And one is a question, is NATO useless? And another question is, why are we focused so much on what we can do for others? Shouldn't our foreign policy reset focus more on how this can assist Canada meet our national interests? What can we be doing for ourselves? Your thoughts, colleagues?
Well, maybe I could start with this one. But I would begin by saying to Peggy that I wasn't defending the Lima Group. I was just giving it as an example of one of the few things that Canada actually bothered to do over the last couple of decades without commenting on the content. And actually, I subscribe entirely to your critique of the nature of their activities, which in fact have been profoundly unhelpful. Is NATO useless? Generals and admirals generally don't think so, and various bullet heads in civil society want to defend it. My view is that it should have been dissolved at the time that the Warsaw Pact broke out. Its provocative movement march eastward during the 90s and the Yeltsin years, when Russia was really down and out, I thought was like kicking the bear in the head and was unbelievably stupid. The current deployment of troops, including Canadian troops, to the Baltics, I think is provocative. And if anyone asked me for my advice, and no one ever does, I would have recommended against it. But finally, and you mentioned this, Margaret, for what it's worth, Global Affairs Canada did recommend against the 2020 Security Council bid, and as is often the case, were completely ignored.
Okay, that's good to hear. That's actually very good to hear. That's very good to hear. So that means that the UN division, at least at Global Affairs, was still on the ball. Was still very much on the ball. I agree. I mean, with respect to the NATO, is NATO useless? I also agree with Daryl about how it should have been wound up, because it's now become, a problem. It's not just that it's not useless. I actually would prefer it if it was just useless. It's now a part of the problem. And a particular part of that ties back in when I've been discussing the existential threat of a potential nuclear war. Because what membership in NATO does is it's made Canada essentially a nuclear weapons apologist. And when this groundbreaking Nobel Peace Prize winning treaty to ban nuclear weapons was negotiated by the vast majority of the world community that were so fed up with no progress towards nuclear disarmament, on the day that it was open for signature, this is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, NATO countries issued a statement denouncing the treaty. Now, it is one thing for the argument to be made, and Canada makes it, that the time is not right, to negotiate I don't agree with this, but this is the argument they make. It's one thing to say the time is not right, tensions are too high, we can't move to nuclear disarmament. It's quite another to issue a statement denouncing a treaty which is trying to provide a path towards the elimination of nuclear weapons, which is a treaty obligation of every member of NATO under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There is an Article 6 treaty obligation on all members of the NPT to work towards, to negotiate in good faith towards the elimination, with the goal of the elimination of nuclear weapons. And so what does Canada do? Canada joins in. And again, this is the absent foreign minister at the time, because the new foreign minister has tried to be much more conciliatory and positive about efforts by others. For example, Sweden has a big initiative, Stepping Stones Towards Nuclear Disarmament, in the lead up to what was to have been the 2020 review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Everyone was very worried about how that was going to go, because we're not only not making progress in getting rid of nuclear weapons, of course, we're going in the opposite direction. US has a $2 trillion nuclear modernization process. All the other 8 nuclear armed states have various types of modernization. new roles for nuclear weapons. The United States is identifying new roles for nuclear weapons. And a big statement was just issued recently by the European Leadership Network, which is a lot of former generals and diplomats from Europe and from North America, who said that it appeared that the one lesson from the Cold War, the one enduring lesson, a nuclear war cannot be won and so must never be fought, was no longer, being adhered to in any way. It was no longer being uttered, being supported by the United States and to a lesser extent Russia. But in that regard, I would hasten to add, because we constantly hear about the China threat, the only one of the declared nuclear weapon states that has a no first use of nuclear weapons policy is in fact China. Their policy is they will not use them except in response to a nuclear attack. So
speaking of China and another nuclear power, the United States, very interesting question among the many that have arisen. What viable options for Canada to balance escalating tensions between the US and China, and which option advances Canada's interests and security most, in your view? May I ask you both?
Well, maybe I could start with that, but you asked us a question that I didn't get a chance to respond to, and that was General Cox's, I thought, very succinctly put question about, where is the leadership, where are the ideas, whether it's serving as a bridge between the US and China, or restarting a diplomatic initiative. And what I want to say is that, after my 30 years in the Foreign Service, the problem resides with, I think, the bureaucratic culture of Global Affairs Canada, and it has always been so. It is so atrophied. It is so stratified. It is so hierarchic. Social and professional relations are so authoritarian. It rewards ambitious careerists. It discourages dissent. Any original and creative thought that tends to come from the bottom, by the time it's worked its way up the 8 layers to the minister's office, is usually so homogenized and watered down that it's completely unrecognizable. I mean, the weakness of the leadership, the fact that the place is run now by people that tended to make their careers during the decade of darkness under Harper and were rewarded for keeping the lid on rather than for coming up with creative ideas, which used to be the hallmark of Canadian diplomacy. I mean, listen, Global Affairs Canada is one sick puppy, and there's simply no way that we're going to get the kind of leadership that General Cox was talking about out of that place. So it's going to have to come from somewhere else.
I'd like to do the same thing that Daryl did before getting to the very important China question. I didn't answer the question about why are we always looking at helping others and not looking after Canada's national interests. And of course, I would argue that it's in our enlightened, there is actually no conflict. And our enlightened self-interest tells us that if we do not help developing countries to become resilient and to build strong economies, that's going to lead to it's certainly not going to help with trade, and we're a trading nation, but it also exacerbates other problems like migration. So it's in our interest and other issues like the COVID pandemic that we're dealing with, we need to strengthen the global public health network, not just Canada's. So it's very, very, very much in our interest that we work to strengthen the global community. And I have to say, on a positive note for Canada, our COVID diplomacy has really been quite extraordinary. We have been, while the Prime Minister has to manage all of the provinces, because he doesn't have the lead on most of the stuff, while he's been managing all of that, we've also been engaging in a very, very active international diplomacy with the World Health Organization, with the UN Secretary General, to ensure fair access to medicine and equipment, and to help with recovery when that time comes, to ensure there's a global fund, and also, perhaps most important of all, to ensure equitable access to a vaccine. So Canada, and that's all, of course, very much in our interest. But I now want to come back to this very, very important question about what does Canada do to balance these increasing tensions. In the short term, really, the answer is pray that Biden is elected president. Because with Trump the way he is now, all Canada can do, and I say all power to this government for keeping that border closed to non-essential travel and to managing, and that requires managing the Trump White House. And so long as our overriding concern has to be to avoid upsetting a sociopath at best in the White House, then there isn't a lot of room for finding that role that we need to find, because it is most definitely not in Canada's interest to do anything to encourage and to support the building of these two competing blocks. We will be huge losers in that. Unfortunately, we fell into the trap. I mean, CEO Meng should never, ever have been picked up by Canada. This is a U.S.-China fight over primacy in 5G technology, and Canada got suckered into arresting her, and it would have been tossed out as not meeting the test of double criminality because, of course, those illegal Iranian sanctions Canada doesn't have. So they tacked on this absolutely spurious, and the evidence is coming out how spurious, fraud charge. When the fraud turns out to be, the briefing of individuals, alleged briefing of individuals in the American office about activities, perfectly legal activities, that Huawei was engaged in with respect to Iran. So, because bear in mind that these sanctions that the United States has imposed on Iran are illegal under international law. So really too bad.
Thank you so much, Peggy. That's great. And that in fact segs into the next question, which is from Bruce Montador, chair of the Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council's National Capital Branch. And this is in terms of another aspect of weaponization of policy, which, by the way, we shouldn't count on Biden for not using these tools himself. But anyway, Bruce's question is, how should a foreign policy reset deal with realities like the weaponization of the US dollar? And do we even have the tools to do that?
Can I jump in first on the dollar one? Just because it so happens that there is, that the former governor of the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney, while he was still the governor of the Bank of England, made an extraordinary speech in August of 2019, at a meeting in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, of central bankers from all over the world. It's a speech that's gotten relatively little coverage, where he said that the world has got to end its reliance on the increasingly destabilizing US dollar. And what he proposed was a publicly controlled digital currency supported by central banks that would be based on a basket of commodities. And so it's very, very interesting that a very highly respected, and he made this proposal while he was still head of the Bank of England, that drawing attention to the fact that it's just not sustainable. Continuing on with this role, ever more destabilizing role, I've just mentioned one aspect of it, of the US dollar, is simply not sustainable. And coming back to the Biden, yes, we cannot assume that once these powerful tools are there, that Biden won't be tempted to use them. But Biden can at least be negotiated with. We can have respectful debate back and forth. But of course, the other big thing about the American election is that the Democrats also have to retain control of the House. And if we really want to see any meaningful change, the Democrats actually have to get control of the Senate too, because that's the treaty power. So yes, but first things first, getting Trump out of there will give us more breathing space, and it will allow countries, and Canada can play a role in this. Canada has tried. Other countries that have, like Germany and France, that were talking about the importance of multilateralism, that, Canada can dialogue and we can discuss, and therefore we're coming to United States, with a group of like-minded countries that are making proposals that we would argue are also essentially in the interest of United States as well.
Colleagues, we're being deluged with questions and we're running out of time, alas. So I will read out one final question, but I would ask that you both, in either addressing it, seg into your concluding remarks. And the question from Fiona McMurran is, why has globalization resulted in an increase in parochialism? Can we blame neoliberalism? So over to you both, and please seg into your concluding remarks. We've got 4 minutes left.
I would describe, Margaret, globalization as being fundamentally neoliberal. It worships at the altar of markets. It favors deregulation and is very antithetic towards the role of the state in progressively redistributing resources. So there's winners and losers under globalization. It does a very good job of effectively allocating resources, or shall we say efficiently allocating resources. But there's a downside to that. Not just if you're on the underside of globalization, as much of the world's population is, but as we've seen with COVID, these global supply chains are extremely fragile and prone to breakage and prone to interference. So neoliberal globalization as an alternative, say, to capitalism, which is being more effectively regulated in the broader public interest, I don't think compares very well. And I mean, I'm all in favor of international trade and investment, but it can't be organized mainly for the benefit of the 1%. So that's my response to the question. And in terms of segueing into what I would consider to be my takeaways for today, so how can we address these significant shortcomings which we've identified? There's a yawning say-do gap between rhetoric and reality in terms of the government's messaging. Canada's position on the world stage I would describe as spectral. We have a foreign ministry which is dramatically underperforming. We have a foreign service which is demotivated and down and out, and people are leaving. So the whole diplomatic ecosystem is in crisis. So what do we do? So I want to suggest 5 R's. They're very simple. The first is reinvest. Reinvest in diplomacy and development. In terms of total government expenditures, it's barely a rounding figure. It's chump change. It should be the easiest thing for the government to do, and yet serial governments have not only not done it, but the percentage of national expenditure which is going into diplomacy and development continues to shrink every year. Our aid levels are still less than they were in 2011. In 2011, I think they were about 2.8%. At the all-time high point in the late 80s under Mulroney, We hit 0.56. That's the closest we've ever come to Pearson. And poor Global Affairs Canada, it's just been a relentless shrinkage in the aid base. So reinvest. Second, reconnect with the traditions of Canadian internationalism. Look back to the things that we've done in the past, and okay, we may no longer be able to be in a position to bring peace to the world, to feed the hungry, to reform international institutions. But as Mr. Axworthy showed us, if we identified the areas where we can make a difference and pour our resources into them, we can get a landmine ban, we can get an international criminal court, we can get a major initiative on children in conflict, we can get the Kimberley Agreement on blood diamonds, we can launch the responsibility to protect process. There are things we can do, but we need a demanding foreign minister and we need the resources to do it. So reconnect with these traditions of Canadian internationalism. Second, reposition.
Go ahead.
Pardon?
I was going to say 1 minute and we'll move to Peggy.
Okay, reposition Canada. I think we should be a bridge. I think that science diplomacy and international S&T have got to play a major role in rekindling that spirit of diplomatic initiative, which is my fourth R. And finally, this foreign policy review, it's urgently required, and we need to engage other government departments, provincial and municipal governments, universities, NGOs, think tanks, and not least, the Canadian public.
Brilliant. Peggy.
Well, I know that, essentially the time has run out. Unsurprisingly, I agree with all of the R's, with all of Daryl's R's. And I would just give one concrete example of something that Canada could do right away, not just in our re-engagement in peacekeeping, not just meaningfully re-engaging, managing to get our troop level up to that level, to a level equal to tiny Ireland, but going beyond that. We championed in the past, we were thought leaders in a UN emergency peace service, meaning a standing capacity, because one of the problems with UN peacekeeping is it takes so long to cobble together the troops, the police, and all the civilian elements, losing vital time in consolidating the peace agreement. So Canada's re-engagement should be UN, 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 and one of the first things that we can do very, very quickly is strengthen the UN's capacity for building a sustainable peace. All the evidence shows that the best chance of a country coming out of conflict for building a sustainable peace is a comprehensive UN peacekeeping mission, which isn't just a military component. It has rule of law, it has governance, and it helps the parties, the former warring parties, to build the institutions necessary for a sustainable peace. So that's something that Canada can take on board right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. And I must say we're getting lots of complimentary remarks from the audience. I know there are a lot of questions that have been left hanging, but through the group of 78, able to answer those and make sure that they're together with the recording of this event. I'd especially like to thank all those who tuned in today, to those who maybe are now working on foreign policy in organizations like Global Affairs, former colleagues. If you disagree with what is being said, do also let us know. Perhaps there are momentous changes that we're not aware of, but we'd also like to know about the successes. For young people and for all those who are interested in the organizations that were represented here today, the Group of 78, the Rideau Institute, the Canadian International Council's National Capital Branch, and across the country, in fact, 16 offices now. We do have, by the way, a very lively mentorship program. We're always looking for more mentors. The demand from young wannabe mentees is greater than our capacity to deliver. So if you can engage, please do. And the warmest of thanks to our hosts again, the group of 78. Thank you all. Bye-bye.